Hey everybody, I thought I would try to do a little personal interaction with you via video where you can see my face. Unfortunately, I can't see you. But I just wanted to share a thought with you that's been really important for me through the years, thinking about our confidence in what we're calling missional ministry. In some ways, it's an older view of what evangelism is. I work for the Mission of Young Life, I told you before. I got a Bible here. It's an older Bible called the J.B. Phillips translation. I don't know if you've ever seen that before. I'd say it's this. It's the Message translation before there was the Message. This dates back to the early 1960s. But a lot of people who worked for Young Life back in the old days would carry this Bible around. They said it looked kind of like an old school cookbook. And they would feel a little more comfortable standing up in front of a group of kids giving a talk out of it because it didn't seem so imposing like a giant Bible might. So I'm using my old J.B. Phillips Bible here just to share a thought with you. When we think about, in the Young Life realm, when we think about ministry to adolescents, we were always taught through the years, beginning with our founder, Jim Rayburn, starting in the 1940s, had this primary conviction that if the gospel is presented clearly, if Jesus is presented clearly, then people will want to know him. Jim Rayburn used to say this all the time, that Jesus Christ is the most fascinating person in all of human history, and that he would completely captivate the heart of any young person who had the chance to get to know him. And that was always our mission too, is this conviction that Jesus is the grandest, most attractive person who ever walked the face of the earth. In other words, and we would say this, that if Jesus showed up on a high school campus or in somebody's workplace, that people wouldn't run from him, they would run to him. Now, I wonder what you think about that idea. Do you think if Jesus showed up today, anywhere like where you are, do you think that people would be drawn to him, or do you think that people would run away from him? My conviction is, because he represented the fullness of what it means to be a human being, that people would be drawn to him instantly because of this weightiness that he possessed. So for example, in the Gospel of Mark, and I think you know this story, it's the first chapter, as Jesus has announced the kingdom of God, and then he begins to demonstrate what the kingdom is like. He goes to Capernaum, he begins to heal all the sick in that day, and that's the story where there were evil spirits. Peter's mother-in-law was ill, and he heals them. And then he heals a great number of people who were suffering from various forms of disease. Evil spirits were coming out. It says that early the next morning, in verse 35, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a deserted place. And there he prayed. But then Peter and his companions went looking for him. And when they found him, they said, "Everyone is looking for you." Now that's a really interesting phrase, isn't it? I wonder what you think about that. Do you think that everyone is looking for Jesus? I would submit to you, and I want this to frame how we think about missional ministry, is that all the things that we see people doing in this world, everything that they're pursuing, living out their desires, at the core of it, it really is this single desire. They're looking for Jesus. I want you to think about that this week and in the coming weeks. I want you to observe people in your communities and where you are. And I want you to ask yourself, are they really looking for Jesus? In the same way that Peter thought everyone in the village was looking for Jesus, I think it's true. I think everyone at their core is looking for Jesus. Now sure, deep desires get distorted, and the world offers all kinds of shortcuts and distorted versions of answers to that deep desire. That doesn't mean, though, that people aren't looking for Jesus. So I want you to practice this. If you go to a coffee shop and the barista is there that you often see, I want you to ask yourself, are they looking for Jesus? As you're driving through traffic, as you see people who are strangers on the street, I just want you to continue to ask this question, are they looking for Jesus? Because the answer is yes, they are looking for Jesus. And if we believe that everyone we encounter is looking for Jesus, I think we go more confidently. Again, he's the grandest, most attractive person to ever walk the face of the earth. And so we represent him We go in his place as his representatives to the world, and we make him known. But because he's so attractive, he does all the work. We don't have to. So that's just a thought for us as we begin this week, developing more and more so our understanding of what missional ministry is. So the rest of the lecture is going to continue from here, but I just wanted to share that thought with you today.
Okay, let's get into the heart of what we want to talk about for this week's lecture, which is the aim of missional ministry. And as I've said before, missional is not a code word for evangelism or a new way of talking about evangelism. It's not how to think about mission trips. It's much larger than that. That picture is going to get filled in as time goes on, but we're just going to keep using that terminology to help kind of paint a canvas, a bigger picture of what we mean by missional ministry. And the aim of missional ministry is this. It's a transformed life that bears witness to life in the mission of God. We used the word conversion last week. It gets used again in some places. That's not a out-of-date term so much. We may not be talking about, hey, let's talk about how you get converted. That's not common conversation these days, but theologians use the word conversion in the Ordo Salutis, the Latin words for the order of salvation. So that's why it shows up a lot in our literature and our reading. In my mind, this idea of a transformed life is a synonym or synonymous with this idea of conversion. Conversion from, conversion to, transformed life from a life in the past that is now a life that reflects a human being fully alive, living into wholeness. So that life is shaped by a particular trajectory, a way of being, and that is the mission of God. So a transformed life bears witness to or points to life beyond itself. That life beyond itself is the overarching grand narrative of God at work in the world, or the mission of God. Now, one of the things that I want you to be paying attention to as we're thinking through some of this new terminology here is how this will shape how would you essentially describe what the gospel is in light of perhaps some of these new terms or these different dimensions of working with them. I want us to begin to think in a fairly concise way how we would describe what the gospel is. So that's going to be one of your discussion board assignments this week in light of the readings and in light of the content from these lectures here. And the reason that I want you to do that is because I want us to make sure that we have a vision beyond our typical understanding of evangelism as getting souls saved so that they go to heaven when they die. The evangelical movement beginning in the 1940s in the US and in the West, that has been the key emphasis when we talk about evangelism. In some way or another, a formulation of the gospel such that people admit that they're a sinner, that Jesus died for their sins, and now that they go to heaven when they die. Now, that's not untrue, but that idea, that concept is deeply rooted in a sense that the most important dimension to evangelism is freedom from. What we're freed from, what Christ's death on the cross has freed us from. But that formulation is actually very weak in creating a vision for what we're freed to, beyond the fact that we will go to heaven when we die. In other words, there's not much of a vision for life in the in-between. And missional ministry really does answer the question, what we're freed into or what we're freed to. One of the real challenges or one of the problems in our experiences with evangelism as we've reduced the gospel down to a formula is, for example, it ignores some significant dimensions of the gospel writings themselves. So, for instance, the prophetic dimension to Jesus' ministry, and by prophetic I don't mean predicting the future, I mean that cry of Jesus to his people to regain their sense of identity as God's people. So his cries for justice, his advocacy for the poor and for the marginalized, his commitment to healing the sick and feeding the hungry, those prophetic dimensions of Jesus' ministry essentially get ignored or lost in this oversimplified formulation of the gospel that only really focuses on what we're freed from. Whereas in Jesus' ministry, a significant part of the gospel writings themselves are devoted to Jesus bearing witness to the mission of God, where in his kingdom formulation there is justice, there is advocacy for the poor and the marginalized, there is healing for the sick, there is the feeding of the hungry. And that trajectory of bringing those kind of elements of life to bear and moving them in towards wholeness is the mission of God. But those get lost in our oversimplifications of the gospel formula. They don't really create, those formulations don't create, again, a vision of what we're free to. There's no sense necessarily that from that point of conversion or transformation or raising the hand, praying the prayer, walking the aisle, that they are invited into to be an agent in the mission of God, joining in with God in his missional work in the world. And so what often happens, I've had a number of conversations with adolescents who say, look, I know I'm going to go to heaven when I die, so in essence it doesn't really matter what I do right now. I'll deal with my life and my life choices later on when I'm older, when I'm married, have kids, I go to church, whatnot, but what happens right now doesn't matter. Well, that's clearly not true, but that's what it seems like in that older formulation. The other element of this is, and this could perhaps be your own experience too, without a robust vision for what it means to be an agent in God's mission, oftentimes what happens is evangelism is one element to ministry, and then discipleship is another. And if there's not a robust vision for wholeness, for flourishing in the mission of God, then discipleship becomes something like this. Okay, now I know I'm going to go to heaven when I die. Jesus died for me on the cross. I don't want to disappoint him now, so I'm going to kind of get after it in life and work real hard, and then I'm going to fail, and then I'm going to feel really guilty about that, but then I'm going to commit to trying harder the next time, and then I'm going to fail, and then I'm going to feel some shame and guilt about that, and then I'm going to find a new way of trying harder this time. And discipleship becomes this cycle of effort, failure, guilt, effort, failure, guilt. That's not Jesus' vision whatsoever for life in the mission of God. So we're going to try to reconstruct our vision for what the gospel is. And as we're trying to build this vision for missional ministry, I want you to know this is not necessarily a new idea. In the history of the church, strains of this, and maybe even significant portions of the history of the church, have embraced this missional idea. So in some ways, missional ministry is a recovery project. So that's why I've had you read The Celtic Way of Evangelism. So maybe it initially seems like a theme of the class is why don't we try to be a little more Celtic? And you might be thinking, okay, what's up with the Celts? Why is there so much emphasis on Celtic Christianity? It's really in the beginning, so we're going to move on from here. But I think one of the reasons why, particularly as you're reading the Celtic Christianity book, here's the thing: the Celts just seem to address a zone of human life and human concern that a lot of Western Christianity, particularly in the modern period, or modern rational approach to Christianity, and even other religions, just have generally ignored. But we live in a postmodern world, and postmodern people are typically suspicious of institutions. They're suspicious of history that imposes traditions, because with those institutions and that history, there are often these claims of ultimate authority. This is the way things are, or we might call it in our realm, truth with a capital T. And postmodern people are just inherently suspicious of those kind of claims, or they're also suspicious of ultimate explanations that tend to try to oversimplify the problem and give an answer with certainty. It's the projection that we've got it all figured out here. Come to our side because we kind of know how it is. This is the way it works, and that you can be certain of it. The reality is, I think most people in a postmodern world are not really asking what makes sense or what's logical or what's certain. They're asking what's real and how can I count on it? How can I know what's real? And the Celts just kind of had that sort of idea. Their emphasis wasn't on necessarily logic or reasonableness or even certainty. They had created sort of a folk Christianity, of faith and community. And so real life was an emphasis. There wasn't as much focus first on the propositional dimensions to belief, the data. Uh, they really tried to address life as a whole and at a level of the questions of everyday life that people tended to wrestle with. And there was a commitment to journey with them. This is, again, going back to that idea of relational touches, rehumanized people, making relational touches with the dehumanized, indentured servants of the world, journeying with them. And they did this, maybe, this might be a bit of an exaggeration, but for our purposes, it's just a model. They may have done this better than anybody else in the Christian movement, maybe at least since the early church. So much, well, I think the preeminent question of our times is, who am I? I think when we look around at popular culture, whether it's in music or in movies, TV shows, this constant theme that seems to be emerging. What does it mean to be me? What does it mean to be human? How do I know what it means to be human? And certainly this is true for adolescents. If you've read Chap Clark, Hurt 2.0, one of the themes that he really does make clear is that culturally speaking, we don't really know how to define or answer the question, who am I? Because for all intents and purposes, adolescents in this transitional stage of life from childhood into adulthood been essentially left on their own to navigate it by themselves. So he calls it abandonment, systemic abandonment. Here's some features of this struggle or this challenge to answer, who am I? In our culture, there is a sort of an assumption that there's unrestricted meaning making. And if you're a teenager, you're an adolescent, this may sound like the greatest thing ever. You can be whoever you want to be. You are free to choose. You can do you. You can be yourself. And again, that might sound like a really good thing. You're free from all these external expectations and ideologies or roles in society. You have the freedom to define yourself. But at the same time, there is really no good guidance or reliable boundaries that gives an adolescent direction towards purpose or meaning. So they may have all kinds of freedom, but they can't really ultimately answer, am I good enough? Or do I matter? I've thought about this analogy. My girls are really into Legos, and we must have, it seems like 10,000 pieces of Legos, and we've got them stored in these little plastic bins. If you open one of those plastic bins and said, here's all the stuff of life right here, you can make whatever you want to make. That might sound pretty invigorating, pretty exciting, but after a while, if you don't have the directions, the visual picture for what this ought to look like, what the finished product ought to look like, at some point this is going to feel like a crushing burden. That freedom now becomes an unbearable responsibility to define yourself with no real vision for what that ought to look like. Secondly, the influence of images on our perception of reality has created a real challenge for us. Adolescents grow up today, all of us for sure, but adolescents particularly grow up in this barrage of images that tell us essentially what is real. For example, what beauty is. It's now determined almost exclusively by external characteristics. There's really no room for internal beauty or internal attributes or virtues, because those are not images. Our culture saturates us with images, so there's really no place for conversation or what Anthony Giddens calls discourse about reality. So certainly, you could think of social media, and we'll talk about that in just a second in a little more detail, but Instagram and Twitter, Facebook for sure. In other words, our reality is fluid and unstable because it's always defined by the barrage of images that are coming our way. So there's no place for you to throw out your anchor. There's no stable place for you to latch on to. So kind of related to that also too is there's this constant change and an endless array of choices. The fact that we can broadcast our change in status, or we can add a new profile picture, or we can show everyone the new shoes that we just bought or the meal that we're eating. It does give us this perception that it's much more of a false perception, but this perception that we are presenting the real me at any given time. But this is one of the, and I'm just going to take a little bit of a diversion here to talk about social media for a second. This is one of the unexamined influences of our communication technology, because the more avenues that we have, we turn up the volume of our social connectedness. And psychologist Kenneth Gergen, I'm not sure if you know Kenneth Gergen, Gergen, has written primarily back in the 90s, but he says we become saturated selves as the demand to keep up or respond to all the connections grow. And so saturated selves have to create what he calls multiple role-related selves to manage the demand. And these multiple selves may not be even compatible with each other. So, for example, the me on Twitter or Instagram may not really be compatible with me in my English class, or on the football team, or on student council, or in the school play. And so this leads to what Gergen calls the conflict of the different me's. The conflict of the different me's. Haven't you seen that kind of thing played out in adolescence before? They live these lives of multiple selves, which, if we think about it, it can just lead to confusion over which is the real self in the life of an adolescent and which one is a projected self. So again, Gergen was writing this at a time before there was even all these social media platforms, but he was really ahead of his time, as he was kind of warning that the more voices that we add to our lives, committing to a core identity or answering the question, who am I, becomes really increasingly difficult to do. And interestingly, the promise of technology, and one of the reasons why adolescents love it so much, is it gives us a sense that we can project or define who we are and that we matter, when in reality, we're never actually answering the question, who am I? And it becomes this endless cycle, because there are all these demands, or these voices that are coming at us from our social media and other experiences in everyday life through all of our connectedness. So how do they mediate all this? Well, they turn back to social media to be able to kind of help themselves interact with all the barrage of voices and images that are coming at them. So it becomes this cycle. We're out in the world of all these voices and disparate images, and we have to go back into social media to manage it all for us too. So like Facebook or Instagram allows adolescents, and us as well too, to kind of selectively present ourselves in what they call asynchronous media. It's not in real life in real time. It's kind of on our own timeline. In fact, we can make our own timelines. We can have our Facebook timeline, or we can have our Snapchat timelines as well too. And we can take that time and modify it and carefully select the ways or the aspects of our life that we'd want to emphasize or present out into the world. And again, this doesn't help us really answer the question of who am I. It just continues to present more choices and options, which causes us to retreat back into social media to help us mediate or manage all of those choices and options. Let's transition here just to kind of back to the big idea of what we're trying to observe in ministry, kind of where we are now today. I think another significant thing that we have to say is true is that Christianity, at best in the West, is a second language or a second culture. In the U.S., especially when youth ministry began, Christianity was the dominant religion. It didn't mean that others weren't religious. There weren't other religions. There weren't people who were Jewish or Muslim. They were probably a smaller percentage of people, and they were isolated to certain parts of the country. However, even though people were maybe not even actively involved in participating in a Christian church, they nonetheless consider themselves Christian. They would have not called themselves a nun, no religious affiliation whatsoever. They wouldn't have done that. They certainly wouldn't have called themselves an atheist or an agnostic. That would have been totally taboo socially. And they would have generally been committed to and in favor of value systems in civic life and politics and other dimensions of culture that were reflective of Judeo-Christian values. That just would have been the norm for our culture. So it didn't mean we were particularly Christian. It didn't mean that there were a super high percentage of people who really were devoted followers of Jesus. It just meant that we were Christian nominally, civically, and culturally. But it was the dominant language of our day. It was kind of our first culture. So again, the earlier lecture where I talked about the need for us to be those who walked along the wall, using that event in the history of Israel, where the Assyrians were laying the city of Jerusalem under siege, and we had the administrators of the palace who walked along the wall, and they were bicultural. And on the inside of the wall was the first culture of the people. That was where together the people were gathered together, and they were reminding themselves of the story of Israel. Here's who God is to us. Here's what Yahweh has done for us in the past. He's the one with whom our salvation lies. And they told the stories of their first culture there. And then outside the wall was this new culture that was trying to attack or overrun. And in the Kenda Creasy Dean book that references this event as an analogy for contemporary ministry, she was making the point that we as youth workers have to kind of walk along the wall. We have to be bicultural, bilingual, and understand the language and customs and habits that are outside the wall, but also we have to be participants in the culture inside the wall. It's a great analogy, but my contention would be that for most adolescents, it's the culture outside the wall that is their primary or their first language, and that they're typically, not always, but typically, in general, they're participants in the inside the wall culture is kind of a second language. So outside the wall, the culture has its own language, symbols, customs, and it is the primary shaping culture of belonging for adolescents. But to speak of anything Christian is to make, really, I think, an enormous assumption that they are familiar with that inside the wall culture. They used to be, as I said, because this sort of language was more common inside and out. But today, inviting someone to consider Christianity is not asking them to consider the logic of Christianity. It's not inviting them to consider necessarily the propositions of Christianity or even the facts of Christianity. That Jesus lived, he died for our sins, and he rose again so that we might have eternal life in him. Those things are true. And they're true with a capital T. They might be familiar, but really asking someone to consider Christianity now is a lot more akin to asking someone to move to a whole new culture, to unfamiliar territory, to a whole new way of life. Because the Christian ideas, the Christian values that used to shape the surrounding culture are no longer there. So some of you have probably had this experience before where you've visited another country or another culture and you found yourself at times a bit uncomfortable with learning what the proper customs or habits were. Now, if you come from the United States, we tend to think the rest of the world should kind of adopt its culture to us when we arrive in their country. We tend to think that we do things the right way, and everyone else needs to accommodate us when we show up. But if you're from a culture outside the U.S. and you come to the U.S., you typically don't think that the U.S. should accommodate you. You're trying really hard to learn the culture and the symbols and the habits so that you can function within that setting. Nonetheless, either way, you've experienced this second culture sort of thing before if you've gone somewhere outside the U.S., if you're an American citizen, or if you're from somewhere else and you've come to the U.S. You've felt that disconnect and that reality that this is much more about propositions or truths. It's not like you just go, I just need to know a few truths about what it's like to be Nigerian. I just need to know a few bits of data about what it's like to be French. The truth is that nowadays, because we don't have any or very little exposure on a large scale to Nigerian or French culture, if we're coming from the U.S., it's like entering into a whole new world. We're kind of learning things from square one. That's in a lot of ways what it's like in our day to begin to ask someone to consider Christianity. Now, this fits just fine with our kind of Celtic view of missional ministry, because the ancient Celts, the Christian Celts, left their homes and they went to new places, and they would create villages, their monastery communities within those new spaces that were foreign territories, and they would invite others to join in and belong and participate in their cultural way of life, which was both Celtic and Christian. So again, their emphasis was on belonging before believing, and that has significance, because I think because this will be an emphasis of our understanding of missional ministry. Now, as I've said, identity is front and center here. It's answering the question, who am I? And what informs your identity, as I've alluded to previously, we'll talk a lot more in great detail, is rooted in creation. That we've been created in the image of God. That's always been the case, so I don't want to try to make it sound like there's no way to understand who we are. This has always been a theological as well as a psychosocial issue. Who are we? But my contention is, now there is just a greater suspicion of institutions. There's a greater suspicion that there is truth out there, that there's ultimate claims about reality or about how things are. At the same time, your adolescence in a very fluid stage of life where you're bombarded with images and entertainment that shape your expectations for reality and shape your perception of what reality is. It's all external and it's all image. Social media plays into this as well. It's very difficult now with an overwhelming demand of connections in different avenues and different platforms to keep up with the multiple me's, as Kenneth Gergen has said. And then there's just very few social structures that will make Christianity kind of a first language of the culture, at least in the U.S. So it makes all of this very, very challenging for us in order to invite someone to consider Christianity. And add to the fact that in adolescence, again, to borrow from Chap Clark, that adolescents exist in a culture of abandonment, where there's not the investment of social capital from adults to guide and navigate them across that transition from childhood into adulthood. In some ways, it might seem as if it's almost nearly impossible. So I mentioned in the last slide that there were social structures that supported, undergirded Christianity as the first language of the culture in the West, and particularly in the United States. So what were those social structures, and where's this idea coming from? You may have read already in Hunter's book, The Celtic Way of Evangelism. He talks a little bit about Peter Berger, who wrote a very influential book in the 1960s called The Social Construction of Reality, which essentially says that in order to believe in anything in a culture, there needs to be a sacred canopy. The sacred canopy is sort of the overarching elements of the culture that are in place that affirm and sustain belief, that kind of play a part in socializing and nurturing belief in essentially anything. So I'll give you in general some of those elements of the sacred canopy that the West enjoyed for quite a while. There were cultural values across the West, and particularly in the U.S. We could say those values were dominated by Judeo-Christian ethics and values. There was strong support for the family, so a number of elements of culture believed in the necessity of the stability of the family and policy and public sentiment were aligned in that direction too. Religious institutions were very important at that time, especially in the 20th century, because there was so much dramatic worldwide social upheaval and political upheaval as well. So, we had two world wars, a Great Depression, the proliferation of nuclear weapons with the threat of atomic bombs destroying the entire world. So religious institutions became the place or the avenue that religious people turn to, and by default that even less religious people relied on to help interpret the times, to help know how to navigate the uncertainty or the chaos of the world. There was a sense of the sacred that generally permeated culture. So there would have been, even in political realms, for example, in the U.S. at the start of, say, one of the world wars, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, World War II, a call to prayer would have been heeded as a legitimate thing. This is what we do because we have a sense of the sacred, the need to connect to something bigger than ourselves. And then in general, again, this is a big generalization, there was a coexistence between what we call belief, trust in a sacred or the transcendent or God, and science, which tended to argue for and trust in a material explanation for the world. Basically, everything that we know is physical. We know it through the five senses. That's what science relies on. And at times, those have created a diametrically opposed argument where science has said that, faith is unreasonable, it's what religious people do, but really the real truth can be found in scientific discovery, scientific method, logic, reason, that sort of thing. There's always been a divide there, or for a long time there's been a divide there, but in times past, in the 20th century for sure, there was at least a coexistence. We could kind of get along there. So when we had this sacred canopy, there was room for Christian belief. There was space for belief. But over time, these things have begun to erode. And let me just make one comment about this. In the West, we've enjoyed a unique privilege to have this sacred canopy in the way that we've had it. This has not been the case throughout all of history, and now all of a sudden things have changed or eroded and gone downhill. This has been just a short window in the overall history of Christianity and the larger history of the world, where we've enjoyed in the West this kind of sacred canopy that sustained Christianity as the primary language of our culture. But as you know, those things have begun to erode, and so these things that we counted on once before to create that sacred canopy have now begun to disappear. And so, of course, the sacred canopy has faded away. And then this consistent belief in Christianity has begun to erode or disappear as well. So what has taken its place? What's taken the place of the sacred canopy? Well, Andrew Root, who is a youth ministry theologian, has written a number of youth ministry books, has written a book called Faith Formation in a Secular Age. And he says that what's taken its place is not a neutral space, but in fact, an increasingly secular canopy. And maybe we can think of this kind of like this. So now there's an interesting relationship between politics and religion, where it used to be that it was fundamentally assumed that all politicians at least needed to acknowledge the importance of being a religious person. Nowadays, that's not the case. And in some ways, there's been an interesting divide. On the left, typically, there hasn't been any sense at all that religion is an important element to the political process. On the right, sometimes it's almost been completely commingled. So this is Western politics anyway, that religion and conservative views are intertwined so much that you can't tell the difference between the two. Increasingly, though, outside of those spheres, there is this question as to whether or not religion is really a public good. There's an increasing number of voices in the culture that have really kind of questioned whether or not religion is valuable at all for the culture. It's fine for you as an individual, what you do in the privacy of your own home, your own private faith, that's fine. But there's a growing suspicion that religion really has any value out in the public. Then similarly, whereas it used to be, many years ago, that we would often want to know what the opinion of theologians or pastors was when we came to really challenging issues of the day. I mean, for example, back in the day, there were famous public theologians like Reinhold Niebuhr or even Karl Barth. They were Time magazine's men of the year at separate times. But nowadays, it tends to be when there are hot button issues or public issues that are portrayed in the media. If there is a religious person who's consulted or asked, they tend to be portrayed as being out of touch with science or public opinion. Then there's this growing questioning of duty and conformity. Coming out of World War II, coming out of the Great Depression, there was this high public value that we need to be unified as a people. So there's a strong sense of duty to our country and our country's values. And it was fashionable and important, and almost there was a social peer pressure to be kind of conformed to the main values of our country. Well, that's certainly begun to fragment in the 60s and 70s, and now really there's a strong underlying suspicion that there's any value in duty and conformity. So a couple places you see that play out, like with regard to these long-standing wars that the U.S. has been a part of in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's not a consistent sense of duty or obligation. I mean, that probably began back in the Vietnam War, but so we have one camp support our troops, other camps get us out of there. With regard to conformity, I think another place where this plays out. This is just my opinion, but in the last few years, in the United States, there was this great debate and divide over NFL football players who were taking a knee during the national anthem, and there really wasn't anything to appeal to in our history that says that's an inappropriate act, but it was this collision between perhaps oftentimes in the older generations or traditional generations, you just don't do that. We have a duty, and we're obligated to conform to our honor of things like the national anthem. On the other hand, you've got a younger generation that feels a lot freer to question duty and conformity. So that's another element of our secular canopy. And then lastly, a lot of talk about the rise of the nuns. Essentially, just now, it's much more acceptable to claim that you have no or little religious affiliation. That used to not be the case. I'm not sure that it meant that anyone was more religious in times past. Maybe they were, maybe they're not. We don't know. But what we do know is that now people feel much more comfortable, especially among younger generations. They feel much more comfortable not identifying with any religion whatsoever. So what Andrew Root says is that really has created this kind of canopy that buffers us as a culture from anything that's transcendent or metaphysical. Metaphysical is just a fancy word for that which is outside of or transcends the physical world. But those are really important questions for us as human beings that are still kind of metaphysical questions about purpose, questions about being. And so whereas before the sacred canopy sustained belief and gave us access to deep questions about what it means to be a human being and what it means to have purpose, now that has faded away in the secular canopy, and we really live in a time where it might be safe to say we live in the denial of the fact that we all long for a sense of something beyond ourselves to give us purpose and meaning. So another way of thinking about this is that we live in a time where there really is an unprecedented challenge of being a person. And I see this played out particularly in the lives of adolescents, but again, as we've said, I think adolescents are something of our marker that helps us sort of see what's going on in the larger culture. So you can picture it like this: the challenge of being a person today, in an increasingly secular society or secular culture, it doesn't mean that people aren't still longing or reaching out for meaning or purpose. They're not. We're seeing that it's clear that people are not satisfied with the things that we've lost in the sacred canopy. There is no coherent grand narrative anymore. There's only fragmented little stories that help give us a sense of belonging or a sense of meaning. In fact, there's been a real concerted effort, especially in academic institutions, to push back against those grand narratives, because the sense was, well, they're forced on us and we don't have the freedom to kind of choose our own identity. But the fallout from that is that people really actually do want a grander story and to help define them. So we have less and less of a cultural exposure to Christianity, and this is really significant for us in missional ministry. As Tim Keller says, that people no longer have the mental furniture in order to picture categories or ideas or abstract concepts that we've taken for granted in our understanding of evangelical ministry in the past. So just conversations about faith, about sin, about God's law, these are things that don't make sense in our culture anymore, because we don't have a cultural exposure to that kind of spiritual or faith furniture like Tim Keller describes it. Also, there's just a lack of spiritual capital in general. And that it doesn't, the reality is, in one sense, the secular world would say, well, we don't need a spiritual capital. But in fact, what you find is that people continue to reach out for something above and beyond themselves in some way or another. Even for the most ardent atheists, oftentimes they elevate science to this kind of transcendent, almost spiritual place, and it becomes their God, which just indicates that people are inherently spiritual. They're inherently reaching out to something above and beyond themselves. And then on another level, there's just a general lack of social capital. Religious institutions and churches in particular historically provided really significant parts of the social fabric of a community. You gathered there with friends and family, neighbors, people in your community, and there were profound connections. And as less and less people go to church, there's no replacement for that kind of social capital. Well, what are the implications of this for ministry to adolescents? And that's going to typically be the centerpiece of our conversations throughout this course of missional ministry. Most of our understanding of ministry to adolescents is still rooted in significant ways in its beginnings, which began in earnest in the 1940s and 50s. There were types of ministry to younger people that seemed to be emerging in the 1860s, 1870s. There were certain movements that began in the early 1900s that sort of faded away. But by the 1930s and 40s, denominations in particular began to really get on board with the idea of creating ministry for youth. Now, let's be clear about this too. These were typically still ministries directed towards more or less suburban white middle class communities, because that's where the denominations tended to be. So when we talk about ministry to youth, we're really still talking about only a segment of the population. This is not necessarily true in rural communities or in minority communities. But this is kind of where youth ministry began in this time period here. And we could have said there were 4 quadrants where kids existed. And we'll look at it this way. High understanding on one end, disinterest on the other end, over in the far right-hand side, no understanding down below, and then over to the left, high enthusiasm. These are all with regard to Christianity. A high understanding of Christianity, disinterest in Christianity, no understanding of Christianity, and high enthusiasm for Christianity. So we had 4 quadrants. In this quadrant 1 here, if you have high understanding of Christianity, you know a lot about it, and you're enthusiastic about it, then you'd be a Christian. In quadrant 2, if you had high understanding, but you were not particularly interested in Christianity, we call you a bored kid. In quadrant 3, it would be high enthusiasm, but just no exposure to Christianity. So you'd be a seeker. And then in quadrant 4, you'd have no real exposure to Christianity and no real interest. And so you're just closed off to religion. Well, in the 1940s and 50s, when youth ministry really began to grow, our population was much more like this. Predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly quadrant 1 and quadrant 2 kids. So we would have a lot of Christian kids. They'd be involved in church, and they'd be involved in these growing youth ministries. But as youth ministry began to really come into its own during this time period, and especially as parachurch ministries came along, Fellowship of Christian Athletes, Young Life, Youth for Christ, they wanted to target kids who were seemingly the kind of farthest kids out, the ones who were not Christians. But probably more often than not, they were targeting quadrant 2 kids, the bored kids, because there were just a lot more of them around. There was such high exposure to Christianity because it was essentially the first religious language of the culture. So they had high understanding, and that was a predominant characteristic across the cultural lines. So what about today, contemporary youth ministry? Well, it probably won't come as any surprise to you that in a lot of ways we have much less understanding, no understanding of Christianity in general. And so we have a high degree, or higher percentage-wise, quadrant 3 and quadrant 4 kids. So we've got kids who might be interested in spiritual things or religious things. There's a degree of enthusiasm for Christianity, but just no exposure to it. And that's more and more common. But we also have a significant population of quadrant 4 kids. There's no exposure to Christianity. There's no real concept of what Christianity is in its truthfulness. There's also just little interest. The implications for us. Well, the implication is this. There is a legacy of evangelical youth ministry that emerged in the 40s and 50s. And this is one of the reasons why I spend so much time talking about ministry to adolescents. I said in the very beginning lecture that adolescents will kind of be our sample population that we'll refer to as we talk about our concepts. We'll root them sometimes in ministry to adolescents. For this reason, think about what youth ministry was in the 1940s and 50s. It was rallies, it was concerts, it was broadcasts on radios that capitalized on things like music and other pop cultural icons or touchstones that drew kids in. Well, what's happened is that the larger church, as it has observed the fact that this brought kids in, that was attractive to kids, they began to copy those ministry forms. So particularly in the 70s and 80s, with seeker-sensitive type churches, we began to upgrade or make our services more contemporary. And what it was is that we began to look a lot more like youth ministry. So in other words, the church began to embrace the idea of attractional ministry, programmatic ministry that would draw outsiders in. And maybe we did this will be a bit of a generalization, but maybe we did this over relational ministry. We went for attractional over relational, or maybe at the expense of relational ministry. So, but here's the problem or the challenge for us, that attractional type ministry might reach people in quadrants 1, 2, and 3, the Christians, the bored, or the seekers. But how do we reach people in quadrant 4? That's really the question that we have to answer. And that really is the heart of what we're talking about when we talk about missional ministry. Or we could say it this way, we're going to have to talk about this in terms of incarnational evangelism. We'll talk more about what that means. But I said from the very beginning of the class, or this lecture, that we have to do this with a commitment to transformation. Missional ministry, or incarnational evangelism, has to be done with a commitment, not just people understanding the basics of the gospel, but that they encounter a process of transformation that leads them into Christ's likeness, becoming more fully alive as a human being in Christ. So how do we do that? If we're going to aim for people in quadrant 4, we're going to have to do a couple things in order for us to really have a missional ministry committed to transformation. One is we're going to have to think through, examine our assumptions about what the gospel really is. Whenever someone says the gospel, whenever when someone says we're going to share the gospel or we want people to know the gospel, automatically we have some assumptions in our heads that what that means. It's a bit of a code for something that we understand. We need to examine that a little bit. And so later this week, you're going to listen to a podcast from Chap Clark that is going to help you rethink in some ways what the gospel is. But secondly, what transformation looks like for people in quadrant 4 is not going to be creating better programs that are attractive, because essentially that probably won't work to draw in people from quadrant 4. That's just not the world we live in anymore. And so we're going to have to think in terms of a theological framework for shaping ministry that will allow us to reach people in quadrant 4. Transformational ministry is going to have to include a much larger vision, a theologically shaped vision, for what we're aiming for, what we're trying to do in inviting people in quadrant 4 into a transformed life. We have to know what they were made for. We have to know the ways that sin has impacted that their origins, and then we have to have a vision for what they're invited into, their transformation or their renewal into fully rehumanized people. We'll say a lot more about that in the coming weeks, but I just want to kind of lay the groundwork that it's transformation that we're after, and it will require a theological framework for thinking through what that is, which might sound a little odd, a theological framework for people who aren't interested in theology or Christianity or religion. Yeah, it does, but the truth of the matter is it's the only way that we'll reach people in quadrant 4 in a meaningful way. All right, so that's what's coming up. Have a great week, and we will be in touch. Talk to you soon.